11 nights of rain-soaked cardboard and a coat that no longer kept anything out. 11 nights of watching leather-clad men roar through an iron gate that never once opened for her. She was 47, and everyone on that block had already decided what she was: a nuisance, a hazard, someone's problem to solve with a phone call. The man who finally crossed the wet pavement toward her was built like a door frame, faded ink from knuckles to collar, a scarred jaw, a leather vest that made grown men cross the street rather than pass too close. 12 days she had waited for this. 3 words left his mouth before he asked her name, and by sunrise, everything the street believed about both of them would be proven wrong, for reasons no one there that night could have predicted. The rain in Duluth in November did not fall so much as arrive sideways, driven off Lake Superior in grey sheets that turned London Road into a river of reflected streetlight. Grace Halloran had learned, over 11 nights, exactly where the awning of the old brick warehouse on Piedmont Avenue kept the worst of it off her shoulders, and exactly which hour the wind off the harbour dropped enough that she could sleep sitting up without her teeth chattering loud enough to wake her. She had not chosen this corner by accident. Of all the doorways and underpasses and church steps in the city, she had chosen the gate of the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club because it was the only place in Duluth she trusted men to leave her alone. The building itself had been a net and tackle warehouse once, back when Duluth's harbour still ran thick with commercial fishing boats, and the brick still bore the ghost of a painted sign for a company that had gone under in the 1960s. The Sentinels had bought it for almost nothing in the 90s, patched the roof, put a bar and a kitchen and a garage bay into the ground floor, and hung a skull and wings patch over the doorway that made half the city cross the street. Grace didn't cross the street. She sat against the cold brick wall beside the gate, wrapped in a wool blanket somebody at the shelter on First Street had given her before she stopped going to the shelter altogether, and she watched. She watched the way the big men on the loud motorcycles moved when they thought no one was paying attention. She watched one of them, heavy-set, bald, a jaw like a cinder block, a back patch that read "President" in small Gothic letters under the winged skull, stop every single night on his way in to look at her, just for a second before he went inside. He never said anything. He never called the police, though she was certain by day 3 that someone in that clubhouse could have had her removed with one phone call. She watched too, because watching was the only skill she had left that anyone might still call a skill. 22 years ago, before any of this, Grace Halloran had carried a laminated badge that said, "Minnesota Department of Transportation, District 1, Structural Inspector," and she had spent her days underneath bridges with a flashlight and a crack gauge, reading concrete the way other people read faces. She still read structures without meaning to. It was a compulsion now more than a career, a leftover splinter of a person she used to be, and it was the reason that on her 4th night outside the clubhouse gate, staring up at the northeast corner of the building where the parking lot met the retaining wall above the old rail cut, she noticed the crack. It was hairline, barely a shadow in the mortar, running diagonal from a drainage scupper down toward the wall's footing. To anyone else it would have meant nothing. To Grace, it meant a dozen years of freeze-thaw cycles working water into a joint that had never been properly flashed, and a wall that was slowly, patiently, losing its argument with the hillside behind it. She did not say anything about it. Nobody had asked her opinion on anything in 3 years, and she had stopped expecting them to. By her 8th night, the men had started leaving things. A paper plate of food set just inside the gate, never handed to her directly, never accompanied by conversation, as if leaving it required no acknowledgement that a person was receiving it. A folded blue tarp appeared on night 9, tucked under the awning while she slept. She never saw who left it. She only knew that the same broad-shouldered man with the president patch walked past her every evening at almost exactly 6:15, and every evening he looked longer than the night before. On the morning of her 11th day, a white pickup truck with a city seal on the door parked across the street, and a man in a windbreaker with a clipboard walked the length of the fence line, photographing the wall, the foundation, the gate. He taped a yellow notice to the brick beside the club's front door before he left. Grace watched him do it from 20 feet away, invisible to him in the way she had become invisible to almost everyone. And she read the notice from where she sat, because 11 years of squinting at inspection reports had left her able to read fine print. At a distance, most people needed glasses for up close. Notice of preliminary structural review. City of Duluth Department of Building Safety. A hearing date, 3 weeks out. A phrase that made her stomach turn, in a way she hadn't expected to feel about a building that wasn't hers. Potential condemnation pending engineering assessment. She had spent 3 years being told, one way or another, that she no longer mattered to any process that used words like that. She almost laughed at the unfairness of it, that the one thing she could still do, the one instrument left in her that still worked, was standing 20 feet from a building about to be condemned for exactly the kind of failure she had spotted 5 nights before anyone with a badge had bothered to look. She didn't tell anyone. She had learned, the hard way, what happened when she told people things about buildings. That night, the temperature dropped harder than it had all month, and by 9 o'clock the rain had turned to a sleet that stung when the wind found an angle. Grace pulled her blanket tighter and told herself, as she told herself most nights now, that morning always came, that 11 nights had come and gone, and she was still there to see each one, and that this was, in its narrow and unglamorous way, its own kind of survival. She did not know yet that the man with the president patch had spent that same evening standing at the clubhouse window with a mug of coffee going cold in his hand, watching her shape huddle against his wall, doing arithmetic of his own. 11 nights, a temperature warning on the radio, and a decision he had been putting off for 11 nights too long. Silas Bracken had buried a wife, 2 brothers in the club, and more friends than he liked to count, and in 58 years he had developed a rule about the cold that he did not break for anyone. Nobody froze within reach of him if he could help it. He had broken that rule exactly once, 29 years earlier, in a place far from Duluth, and the memory of it still visited him on nights like this one, sleet ticking against glass, wind finding every gap in an old building's bones. He set the mug down on the bar without drinking from it and walked out through the garage bay into the weather. Deacon Ashby caught him at the door. Deacon was the club's sergeant-at-arms, 34 years old, built like a fire hydrant, and possessed of the kind of certainty that came from having grown up watching his father get worked over by people who looked exactly like the woman outside the gate. Desperate, unpredictable, willing to say anything to get inside a warm building. "You open that gate for her," Deacon said, "and you're opening it for every user and grifter between here and 2 Harbors who figures out we're a soft touch. She's been out there 11 nights, Deacon, which means she's patient, which is worse." Silas didn't answer that. He pulled his collar up and went out into the sleet anyway, boots crunching over the half-frozen gravel of the lot, and Deacon watched him go with his arms crossed and his jaw set, already composing in his head the argument he'd make at church, the club's word for its weekly officers' meeting, about liability, about precedent, about the difference between charity and stupidity. Grace heard the gate hinge groan before she saw him. She looked up, expecting the usual. A glance, a plate left without a word, the sound of boots receding back into warmth that wasn't hers to share. Instead, the big man stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the ice forming in his short beard, close enough that instinct told her to flinch, an old instinct, sharper, deeper, the kind that had kept her alive through things she didn't talk about, told her to hold still and watch his hands. His hands stayed open at his sides. "Get up," he said. Then after a beat that felt to her like it lasted an hour, he added the 2 words that finished it. "Come home." 3 words. She would turn them over in her mind for months afterward, trying to decide whether he'd meant home as in his home, or home as in the general idea of a roof. And eventually she'd understand that he had meant something closer to both, and that the imprecision hadn't been an accident. Inside, the clubhouse smelled like bacon grease and gun oil, and 40 years of cigarette smoke that had soaked so deep into the beams no amount of scrubbing had ever gotten it out. A dozen men in leather looked up from a card game near the bar and went silent in a way that made Grace's shoulders climb toward her ears. A short, wiry man with a grey ponytail and an apron tied over his cut, Everett Lang, the clubhouse's cook and unofficially its closest thing to a chaplain, took one look at her and disappeared into the kitchen without a word, returning 90 seconds later with a bowl of chili so hot it fogged her glasses. "Sit," Everett said. "Eat before anybody asks you a single question." Nobody did, not that first night. Silas gave her a room at the end of the hall that had belonged once to a prospect who'd moved on to Fargo, and told her the door had a lock and the lock was hers. Deacon watched all of it from the bar with an expression that suggested he was counting the silverware. The city inspector came back 3 days later, this time with a woman in a blazer from the mayor's economic development office, and the 2 of them stood in the gravel lot, pointing at the retaining wall and murmuring words like waterfront redevelopment corridor and opportunity zone in tones that made Deacon's neck go red. Grace watched from the kitchen window, drying a dish that didn't need drying, and understood with the particular clarity of someone who had spent a career reading the difference between a genuine safety concern and a safety concern being used as a lever, that the building's crack was real, but the urgency being wrapped around it was not entirely about the building at all. She still said nothing. 3 years of being told her opinion carried no professional weight had trained the words to die in her throat before they reached her lips. It was Officer Regina Voss, stopping by on a welfare check the department ran routinely on the club, who finally asked Grace her last name, and upon hearing it, went very still. "Halloran," Voss repeated. "Any relation to the Halloran who used to inspect the interstate bridges? There's still a plaque with that name on it at the district office for the lift bridge deck rehab back in—" She stopped, studying Grace's face, doing the math on what circumstances might turn a decorated state inspector into a woman sleeping outside a motorcycle clubhouse. "That was me," Grace said, and for the first time in 3 years said it like it still meant something. Voss didn't press further, though Grace could see the questions stacking up behind the officer's eyes. How does a district-level structural inspector end up sleeping outside a motorcycle clubhouse on Piedmont Avenue? What happened in the gap between a plaque on a wall at the district office and a wool blanket on wet brick? Grace didn't offer the answer, and to her surprise, Voss didn't ask for it. She simply wrote something in her notebook that wasn't a citation, tipped her hat toward Everett's kitchen window, and told Grace, almost gently, that she was glad to see her somewhere warm. That night, after the clubhouse quieted, Grace lay on the narrow bed in the room that had belonged to a prospect now in Fargo, and let herself remember, for the first time in a long while, the exact shape of the life the accident had taken from her. Her husband, Daniel, had been 49, a millwright at the paper mill on Rice's Point, and he had died on a Tuesday in March under circumstances the company's lawyers had spent 11 months arguing were nobody's fault in particular. Grace had missed 4 site inspections that spring. She had missed a 5th in June on the pedestrian bridge over Highway 61, and that was the one her supervisor had used, not unkindly, to explain why her position was being restructured. By the following winter she had missed her mortgage twice, and by the spring after that she had missed it enough times that the bank stopped sending warnings and started sending men with paperwork instead. She did not tell any of this to Silas, not yet, but she noticed over the following days that he never once asked her to. Word moved through the clubhouse fast, the way weather moved through the harbour. By the following week, most of the sentinels knew the woman Silas had brought in from the cold had once held a state engineering credential, and most adjusted their opinion of her exactly as much as that fact demanded, and not 1 inch further. Deacon Ashby did not adjust his opinion at all. "Credentials expire," he said to Silas in the garage, torque wrench in hand, not looking up from the transmission he was rebuilding. "People don't get their whole life together in 3 weeks because somebody feeds them chili. My old man ran a shop that gave guys out of county lockup a chance, and half of them stole his tools inside a month." "She's not stealing tools, Deacon. She's not doing anything yet. That's my point." He wasn't entirely wrong to be watchful, and Silas knew it. The club had taken risks on people before, and twice it had cost them, and Deacon's caution wasn't cruelty. It was scar tissue, and Silas understood scar tissue better than almost anyone alive because he was made of it. Grace, for her part, made herself useful in ways too small to argue with. She fixed the clubhouse's ledger, kept for 6 years in a spiral notebook with arithmetic errors compounding line after line, and handed it back to the treasurer reconciled to the penny. She noticed the garage's compressor was wired through a breaker 2 sizes too small for the load, said so quietly, and turned out to be right. A fire that might have started that winter did not. She kept the crack in the retaining wall to herself for 11 more days, watching it the way she'd once watched 100 bridges, because being right too loudly, too fast, in a room that didn't yet trust her, was its own kind of danger. The hearing notice sat taped to the corkboard by the bar, 3 weeks becoming 2, becoming 10 days, and the club's lawyer, a heavy-set, exhausted man named Grant Ferro, who handled most of their legal matters for cases of beer and goodwill, kept telling Silas the same thing at every meeting: the city's engineering report, commissioned from a firm with ties to the development company eyeing the waterfront parcel, called the building at imminent risk of structural failure and recommended condemnation over repair. Nobody in the club had the money to commission a competing assessment or anyone qualified to argue the point before a hearing board. It was Everett who finally said, out loud, what half the clubhouse had been tiptoeing around: "We got someone qualified sleeping down the hall." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Grace, cornered by every eye in the room, felt something close over her chest that she recognized from 3 years earlier, the same tightening that had come the week her supervisor told her, not unkindly but not kindly either, that her missed inspections were becoming a liability the department couldn't carry. She had not touched a clipboard, a crack gauge, a laser level since. The thought of standing before a hearing board, defending a professional judgment out loud with her name attached to it, made her hands go cold in a way the 11 nights outside never had. "I can't," she said, and left the room before anyone could answer, and nobody followed her, which she was grateful for and furious about in equal measure. She sat on the end of the bed in the room that was, however, temporarily hers, and looked at her own hands and thought about the last real inspection she had ever performed, a pedestrian bridge over Highway 61, on a grey October morning, very much like this one, 3 days before her husband's accident at the paper mill changed the shape of every day that came after it. She had not finished that inspection. She had walked off the job site when the call came, and she had never gone back, not to that bridge, not to any bridge, not really to herself. It was Silas who came and sat in the doorway that night, not entering the room, keeping the threshold between them the way he'd learned, a long time ago, that some people needed. "You don't have to testify," he said. "Nobody's making you do anything in this club you don't choose." "Then why does everybody keep looking at me like I owe you something?" "Because most of them have never seen anybody get handed a second chance and not know what to do with it, me included some days." He was quiet a moment, the hallway light throwing his shadow long across the floor. "I spent a long time not talking about things I saw when I was 29 years old, because talking about them made them real again. 29 years and I still don't say most of it out loud." She looked up at that. 29 years was oddly specific for a man who rarely explained himself, but he didn't elaborate further, and she didn't ask. And something about the two of them sitting on opposite sides of a threshold, each holding a silence the other understood without needing details, made the tightness in her chest ease by one small, measurable degree. "The wall's getting worse," she said finally. "Not the crack the inspector found. The one behind it, under the northeast corner." Silas went still. "How much worse?" "Worse than a hearing in 10 days is going to fix," Grace said. "If this month keeps raining the way it's been raining." He asked her to show him, and she did, the two of them walking the fence line with a flashlight while the rest of the club slept, Grace pointing out the low place where the asphalt had begun to dish, the rust bleeding down the brick where water had found a path it shouldn't have had. "If it lets go," Silas asked, "how much warning do we get?" "Sometimes none. I've seen walls hold for 6 years past their return date, and I've seen one go in a rainstorm nobody thought was worse than the one before it." She looked at him, at the width of his shoulders against the clubhouse lights, and said the thing she had been circling for days. "You've got a toy drive in 11 days, right on top of that corner." Silas was quiet a long moment, doing the math on 11 days, a lawyer telling him not to touch the property before the hearing, lest it looked like an admission, and a crowd of 140 people who had come to that lot every Thanksgiving for 6 years running. "I'll get sawhorses up around the worst of it," he said finally, "but I can't cancel 6 years of tradition and cordon off half the lot on a hunch, not with the city already circling this place like it's already condemned. Pharaoh says anything we build or tear down before that hearing gets used against us as proof we knew the report was right." "It's not a hunch, Silas. I know that. I believe you. But belief and what I can actually do about it in 11 days aren't always the same size." He rubbed a hand over his jaw, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Keep watching it, every day. You tell me the second the numbers change, and I don't care what Pharaoh says or what the city thinks it looks like. I'll clear that whole lot myself if I have to." It was not the certainty either of them wanted, but it was, for 11 more days, the only promise either of them had to give. The storm that came through Duluth on the 3rd Thursday of November had been forecast for days as an ordinary lake effect system, and it arrived instead as something closer to a gale, the kind of weather old-timers on the North Shore still measured other storms against. By 4 in the afternoon, the harbour was throwing spray over the breakwater at Canal Park, and by 6, the Sentinel's annual Thanksgiving toy drive, the one night of the year when the clubhouse gate stood open to the whole neighbourhood, when 140 children and their families came through for hot food and second-hand coats and a look at the motorcycles that scared their parents and thrilled them, was already underway. Rain hammering the tin roof of the garage bay hard enough to drown out the band. Grace had spent the afternoon watching the northeast corner of the lot with a flashlight and a folding rule, the same instruments she'd carried for 11 years of her old career, and by 7 o'clock the numbers she was getting no longer matched the numbers she'd taken that morning. The crack behind the scupper had opened another 3/8 of an inch since noon. The ground along the base of the wall, where the parking lot's asphalt met the retaining structure holding back the old rail cut, had begun to bulge in a low ridge that hadn't been there the day before. Water pressure building behind a wall that had been quietly failing for a decade and was now failing quickly. She found Silas near the grill, laughing at something Everett had said, a paper plate of cornbread in one hand, and the look on her face when she reached him ended the laughter before she said a word. "That wall is coming down tonight," she said. "Not next month, tonight, maybe within the hour." He didn't ask her if she was sure. That later was the detail she would remember most clearly, that in the space of 11 days he had gone from watching her through a window to trusting her judgment over his own eyes, without needing a second opinion. "How many people?" he said, already turning toward the crowd. everyone within 30 feet of that corner, now. What happened over the next 40 minutes was not clean, not calm, and not the kind of thing anyone present would describe afterward as heroic in the moment it was happening. It was loud and wet and full of frightened children, and a sound system nobody could get to work to make an announcement, so it happened the old way, by men and women moving through a crowd shouting the same handful of words, physically turning families away from the northeast corner of the lot toward the street and the open gate, Deacon Ashby among the loudest of them, his earlier suspicion of Grace nowhere in his voice as he half-carried an elderly woman's wheelchair across the gravel because Grace had told him flatly which 30 feet of ground he needed to clear, and he had simply done it without another word of argument. At 9:52 p.m. that Thursday, with the lot nearly empty and the rain still coming sideways, a groan came up through the ground that everyone standing near the gate felt in their teeth before they heard it, and the northeast corner of the retaining wall let go. 11 feet of century-old fieldstone and mortar sliding downhill into the rail, cut in a slow, grinding collapse that took part of the parking lot's asphalt with it and stopped mercifully, 8 feet short of where the last stragglers had been standing when Grace first raised the alarm. In the chaos afterward, one of the club's newer prospects, a 22-year-old named Cody Fenn, who'd been helping carry folding tables, went down hard when the ground shifted under him and came up with a laceration along his forearm, bleeding fast enough to frighten the people around him. It was Silas who reached him first, kneeling in the mud, and it was Silas whose hands moved with a speed and a certainty that had nothing to do with 58 years of running a motorcycle club and everything to do with something older. Pressure applied in exactly the right place, a belt from his own jeans converted into a tourniquet in under 15 seconds, words spoken low and even to a frightened young man losing blood in the rain. The same words Grace would learn later, that Silas Bracken had spoken to frightened young men bleeding in the mud 29 years earlier in Bosnia as an army combat medic attached to the NATO peacekeeping force outside Tuzla, where he had held more wounds closed with his own hands than he had ever told another living soul about, including his wife, in 30 years of marriage. The ambulance took 11 minutes to arrive, picking its way through streets already littered with downed branches, and in those 11 minutes, Silas never once let go of the pressure he was holding, kneeling in mud that had gone the color of coffee grounds, talking Cody through slow breaths while rain ran off the brim of his cut and down the back of his neck. Cody kept his arm, and the paramedics who finally loaded him into the ambulance told Silas, almost as an afterthought while they worked, that whatever he'd done in those first minutes was the reason the kid still had feeling in his fingers. Grace stood off to the side through all of it, soaked through, watching the same hands that had left a plate of food inside a gate without a word now move with the exact, unhurried precision of someone who had done this before, many times, under circumstances far worse than a parking lot in Minnesota. She recognized the look on his face, too, the particular stillness of a person doing a terrible, necessary thing by reflex, so the feelings about it could be dealt with later, alone, or not at all. Later, long after midnight, when the rain had finally eased and the club sat scattered through the garage bay in shock-quiet clusters, drinking coffee instead of beer, Deacon Ashby found Grace sitting alone on an overturned crate near the wreck of the parking lot and sat down across from her without being asked. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I had you figured for a con before I ever gave you a chance to be anything else." "You had a reason to be careful," Grace said. "I understand it better than you'd think." Silas, passing behind them with 2 mugs of coffee, one of which he set down in Grace's hands without a word, stopped long enough to say the thing he'd apparently been carrying since the gate first opened. People spend so much time deciding what somebody is by what they're wearing, or where they're sleeping, or how long it's been since anybody called them by their right name, he said, that they never stick around long enough to find out what somebody's actually made of. I've been guilty of it same as anybody. Took me until I was almost 60, and watching a woman with a folding rule save 140 people's lives to really understand it in my bones instead of just knowing it in my head. Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. The city hearing convened 10 days later than originally scheduled, delayed by the storm and by an inspection the city itself was now legally obligated to conduct on a wall that had, after all, collapsed in front of witnesses and a responding ambulance crew. Grace stood at the podium in the Duluth City Council chambers on Superior Street, wearing a blazer Everett's wife had loaned her, hands steady on a set of notes she barely needed to glance at, and she spoke for 11 minutes without a single stumble, walking the hearing board through crack propagation and hydrostatic pressure and the difference between a structure that needed condemnation and a structure that needed $11,000 of drainage work and a rebuilt 18 feet of retaining wall. A councilman with close ties to the Waterfront Development Corporation tried twice to characterize her testimony as the opinion of an unlicensed transient with no current standing to assess anything. The second time, Officer Voss, seated in the gallery in her off-duty clothes, stood up uninvited and stated for the record that the district office still had a plaque on its wall bearing the witness's name for work on the lift bridge deck rehabilitation, and that the city's own responding units had treated an injury on the exact stretch of ground the witness had flagged as unsafe 5 days before it failed. The chair gavelled her down, but the room had already heard it, and the councilman did not raise the objection a third time. Grant Farrow, watching from the front row with a legal pad he'd stopped writing on 10 minutes in, would tell Silas afterward that he'd sat through 11 years of hearings in that chamber and never once seen a room change its mind in real time the way it changed for Grace. The Economic Development Office's involvement did not survive the hearing. The condemnation order did not survive it either. What survived was a stipulated repair timeline, a permit, and a plaque-worthy irony that several council members chose to note aloud. The city's own commissioned engineering firm, in a report the Development Corporation had quietly paid to expedite, had missed the exact defect Grace Halloran found sitting on a sidewalk with nothing but a flashlight and 11 years of expertise nobody had thought to ask her about. The Minnesota Department of Transportation called her the following spring, not to offer her old job back exactly. 3 years leaves marks that don't erase from a resume no matter what a hearing board decides, but to ask, cautiously, whether she'd consider consulting on a bridge deck assessment program the district was short-staffed to run. She sat with the voicemail for 2 full days before she called back, turning it over the way she'd once turned over crack patterns, looking for the catch. There wasn't one. She said yes on a Tuesday afternoon in April, standing in the clubhouse kitchen, while Everett pretended not to listen and failed completely. She kept her room at the end of the clubhouse hall for another 8 months after that, not because she needed it anymore, but because nobody, including her, was in any hurry to end the arrangement. When she finally did move into a small apartment on Piedmont Avenue, close enough to walk to the clubhouse on Sunday afternoons, it was Deacon Ashby who showed up uninvited with his own truck to help her carry boxes up the stairs. "You don't have to do this," she told him on the second trip, both of them out of breath on the landing. "I know I don't." He set down a box marked kitchen in her own handwriting and refused, for the third time that afternoon, to let her lift anything heavier than a lamp. "Figured I owed the debt in labor since I already used up my apology on words. My old man used to say, a man's sorry is only as good as what he does with his hands after he says it." He looked at her sideways, something almost like a smile working at the corner of his mouth. "Also, Silas will have my patch if I let you throw your back out on his watch, so it's not entirely selfless." Grace laughed and realized, climbing the last flight with an empty box in her own 2 hands, that it was the first time in longer than she could remember that a joke had reached her before the old grief did. Silas never gave a speech about any of it, beyond the one he'd already given in the garage bay at 1 in the morning, soaked to the skin, with a mug of coffee going cold in Grace's hands. He didn't need to repeat himself. The club rebuilt the wall that spring, with Grace supervising 3 weekends of volunteer labor, 18 feet of new fieldstone laid course by course under her direction, while Deacon ran the wheelbarrow and Everett fed the whole crew off a propane grill set up in the gravel. And by June, the wall that had started the whole chain of 11 nights, 1 storm, and 1 collapsing hillside looked, if you didn't know better, like it had always been there. Grace stood at the edge of the new wall that afternoon in June, running her hand along fieldstone, still faintly cool from the shade, and felt Silas come up beside her the way he always did now, without announcement, comfortable in a silence that had once been unimaginable between 2 strangers on opposite sides of a locked gate. Neither of them said much. There wasn't much left that needed saying out loud between them. The important sentence had already been spoken, once, in a garage bay at 1 in the morning, and both of them had built the rest of the spring quietly around it, the way a wall gets built around a single sound footing. Deacon found them there a few minutes later, wiping mortar dust off his hands onto a rag, and nodded at the fieldstone like a man inspecting his own work for the first time and finding it acceptable. "Held through the last storm fine," he said. "Not that I was checking." "You were checking," Grace said. "I was checking," he admitted, and for the first time since the night she'd arrived, something in his face when he looked at her held nothing guarded in it at all. On the first genuinely warm Saturday of that June, with the harbour calm and gulls working the breakwater and the smell of Everett's grill drifting across a parking lot that had been repaved without a single crack in it, a girl of maybe 7 years old wandered away from a family barbecue 2 doors down and stood at the newly repaired gate, peering through the bars at the motorcycles lined up in rows of chrome and black leather, at the men with beards and tattoos moving between them, plainly unsure whether she was allowed to be curious about something the whole neighborhood had spent years telling her to be afraid of. Everett saw her first. He set down his tongs, walked to the gate, and crouched to her height without a word about motorcycles or clubs or anything requiring an adult's permission. He simply held out a small paper plate with a single warm cookie on it, the same unceremonious gesture the club had once extended to a woman nobody else in the city would look at twice, and waited, patient as the tide, for the girl to decide for herself whether it was safe to take it. She did.